Hello, my name is Estelle Darko, and this is my presentation on forest diversity, dynamics, and resilience in a changing world, which is essentially resilience to climate change. My talk will cover the importance of forest diversity, factors affecting diversity such as forest dynamics, referring to growth, recruitment, and mortality, plants' life history strategies, how they choose to grow, whether they prioritize faster growth or slower growth, and I will also talk about overall how diversity may be linked to climate change resilience and how I plan to study these and what I'm expecting to find. Diversity is an important area of ecology that has been studied by many people for many years. I focus on forest diversity because forests provide key ecosystem services to the planet and are systems that we work to protect. Currently, there are indications that more diverse forests better buffer the effects of climate change, and due to this, I focus largely on tropical forest research because of their high levels of diversity. While there are these research indications, it is not very clear what the relationship is between diversity and resilience. And so my PhD can be split into two main themes where I look at forest diversity and try and understand forest diversity and factors that affect diversity. And then secondarily, or the second part, but not the less important part, is linking forest diversity to forest resilience to try and understand how the diversity is related to how resilient a forest may be. I look at lots of theories of diversity to try and understand the patterns of diversity that we see in the world, and there are many theories which try to explain diversity. One of the main observations when you look at the Earth is the latitudinal diversity gradient. It is quite obvious that when you look at the equator in lower latitudes, there tends to be very high levels of diversity. And as you get to the higher latitudes for the north and south, there tends to be a very great reduction in diversity levels. Some of the bullet points below are theories that try and explain this latitudinal diversity gradient. There are many theories which try and explain the latitudinal diversity gradient, but some of the ones that I've noted here are a bit more relevant to my research, and I focus more on these ones. There is the spatial heterogeneity theory, which theorizes that the tropics are home to more complex environments, which just results in greater levels of diversity. This theory is somewhat intuitive but somewhat complicated to actually research because it is hard to determine whether greater diversity led to a more complex environment or whether a more complex environment led to greater diversity. There is also the productivity hypothesis. This theory posits that the greater amount of productivity occurring in the tropics leads to more diversity because there is simply more energy for species development. There are mixed levels of research support for this theory as well, based on its relation to faster evolutionary speed, but I won't go into too much detail. There is the climatic stability theory, which states that the constancy of resources in the tropics enables greater levels of diversity because it allows the evolution of finer specializations and adaptations. This could be essentially classified as higher levels of niche differentiation, which leads me to the next theory. Niche theory is not directly related to understanding the latitudinal diversity gradient, but is a general theory which is related to diversity. Niche theory refers to the idea that each species can theoretically have its functional role of best fit. This could be related to light requirements, nutrient uptake, water usage, but is essentially how that species best fits into its community and environment around it. There is also the intermediate disturbance hypothesis theory, which theorizes that peak diversity occurs at a point of intermediate disturbance rather than minimum or maximum disturbance. This could be essentially between periods of disturbance, so in between two major events or across a transect of disturbance effects, where it was not the most disturbed by an event, but also not completely unaffected by an event. Because of the fact there is some level of flux and change happening, this would theoretically result in the highest level or the peak level of diversity at that point. The image I have on the slide is related to the latitudinal diversity gradient, showing where some of the highest levels of diversity are found on the Earth. As part of my research into diversity, I look a lot at rare species because rare species are an important part of diversity. The diagram I have on the bottom of this slide is a graph from a very important paper that looked at the functional composition of the Amazon, and they found 50% of individuals in the Amazon were actually made up of only 227 species. That means that rare species that make up a lot less individuals actually contribute a lot to the overall diversity of the Amazon. If you look at the lower part of the graph, about a third of all tree species in the Amazon can be classified as very rare. Looking into rare species is important because it's important to try and determine how much they contribute to ecosystem functioning. There are theories such as the mass ratio hypothesis, which posit that a species' contribution to ecosystem functioning is related to its overall abundance. So a more common or the more dominant species would theoretically contribute more to the ecosystem because there are more of those individual representatives. However, when you look at some of the research, there's indications that rare species are actually very important for functional diversity. Rare species contribute a lot to the functions of the environment. Functional redundancy and functional specialization are important parts of this. When you look at some kinds of environments, grasslands, or certain parts of the tropics, where limited research has been done so far, we found when you simulate the loss of rare species, it seems that functional diversity greatly decreases, which implies that they contribute a lot to functional diversity. And some of them are found to be both highly functionally redundant as well as functionally specialized. But firstly, let me explain functional diversity a bit more. Functional diversity is essentially the diversity of functions that are available in the ecosystem. It is related to the range of functions that an ecosystem is capable of fulfilling. Functional redundancy is when there is a lot of overlap between the functions that certain species can provide. So there may be a few species which are all capable of producing the same function, whereas functional specialization indicates that that species is specially adapted and there's not really any other species that can do the same, that can provide the same functions it can. And when you look at the research, rare species tend to be more functionally specialized, so they may be either less suited to the environments they're in based on some research done in African tropical forests, or they may be actually adapted to environments that are spatially rare in that rainforest. This is all related to fundamental and realized niche, related to the niche theory which I mentioned earlier. The fundamental niche refers to essentially the overall niche of the species, like what it is capable of fulfilling, because the niche is the functional role the species has in the ecosystem. It has this enough plasticity that is able to cover their range of functions, but the realized niche refers to what functions the species is actually contributing in its community. And it's important to see rare species and how how their fundamental niche is different to their realized niche to fully understand how they contribute or how they could potentially contribute in the future as forest compositions change. Additionally, I look into the factors that affect diversity in order to try and better understand the relationships between and the relationship and determinants of diversity in these tropical rainforests. So to look at a species demography, I look at species recruitment, survival, growth, and mortality. Recruitment is related to successful seedings and which ones actually survive to adulthood, how they grow, and later how or why they die. This is part of forest dynamics. Life history strategies are related to how the plant chooses to grow, what it chooses to prioritize. Life history strategies can essentially be put on a spectrum from acquisitive to conservative species. You can have fast growing species which use up a lot of resources in order to grow in a short amount of time. Or you can have more conservative species which grow slowly but tend to be more long lived species. Looking at these life history strategies is important because species tend to fall across the spectrum of them, and you can identify these based on their behavioral traits. And it's interesting to see how it is related to the composition of the forest. Going back to the traits, based on even the type of leaves a species has, these can be indicators of whether they are more acquisitive and trying to consume more resources to try and grow as fast as they can, or whether they're more conservative in terms of retaining resources to essentially ensure they grow slowly and steadily. Other life history strategies include complementarity, which is related to reduced interspecies competition. This means that rather than competing among the different species, there is higher levels of competition within the species. And this is also related to niche partitioning, where each species is essentially fighting within their specific niche rather than between actual species. And this could overall prevent competitive exclusion, where one species outcompetes another for a niche, and thus prevent or reduce the chance of that species going extinct. Buffering effect is another important strategy, and it's related to the asynchronous response of plants to environmental fluctuations and conditions, because they will essentially have different mortality risks. For example, if a drought were to happen in a forest and the species have different levels of drought resistance, certain species would essentially be more likely to die and certain species would be more likely to survive. And this would essentially buffer the overall effect of a drought on the rainforest, because if all the species had the same response to a drought, then there would be a lower risk of survival for the overall forest. If all of them were quite weak to droughts and didn't have much resistance, then should a drought occur, the forest would be extremely damaged and might even die out, compared to if there are asynchronous responses. Some species may be damaged, but some species may not. So there's an overall higher chance of survival and an indication that that ecosystem is a bit more stable due to these different responses. Looking at diversity and understanding it is important to see how it's related to resilience. Resilience in this context is resilience to climate change and looking at how essentially a forest might bounce back or respond to a kind of natural disturbance. To investigate resilience, some of the proxies that I look at are functional redundancy and response diversity. Functional redundancy, I mentioned earlier, relates to whether a group, different species, are essentially able to cover the same kind of function, and that would relate to resilience in the idea that should a species be lost, there is the potential for another species to take up its function, so the overall ecosystem function is not greatly impacted. Response diversity is similar to the buffering effect, where the species have a variety or differential responses to certain events, and thus the overall forest is not going to be completely impacted the same way because there's a variety of responses occurring in the forest. I also look at keystone species, which tend to be species that contribute a lot to the ecosystem, but based on their abundance, you wouldn't expect them to have such a significant contribution to the ecosystem. This is somewhat related to my research into rare species, but is more focused on an individual species that is able to essentially be the keystone of an ecosystem. Plant trait plasticity is similar to the functional niche capacity or the fundamental niche capacity that I mentioned earlier, in the fact that plants are able to, they have a high level of plasticity in their traits, and they're very capable of adapting to different circumstances. And so looking into plant trait plasticity is key for resilience as well, because it's also related to how a plant may respond to an event. Ecological thresholds are a key part of resilience research, because an ecological threshold would be able to tell us at this point where there is too much of this event or too many of this kind of circumstances happened, the forest would not be able to return to its original state or recover to its original state, but instead potentially be forced into another state. An example of this is potentially a forest turning into a savanna, which is a more extreme example, but it's essentially trying to determine where the point of no return for that forest is for it to be irreversibly changed. And to link the two parts of this presentation together, I look at diversity to try and understand the factors that affect diversity, to try and see how diversity buffers the effects of climate change. With the knowledge of how diversity affects climate change, we might be able to better maintain forests and their levels of diversity, and identify which forests need to essentially be prioritized in terms of their diversity, or in terms of aiding restoration efforts to ensure that they will be able to better buffer the effects of climate change, because a lot of the events and disturbances that forests undergo will only be amplified by climate change. Lastly, I would like to explain some of my planned thesis chapters showing how I'm trying to investigate diversity and resilience. The first chapter that I'm currently working on is related to rare species and multifunctionality. In order to investigate this, I am calculating the functional diversity of certain forest stands, and essentially looking at when you remove a rare species compared to a common species, or you're randomly removing species, how does this affect the multifunctionality? And what I'm expecting is that when you remove the rare species, there's a much greater impact on multifunctionality, a much greater decay in essentially functional diversity, compared to when you randomly remove species from the plot, or when you remove common species, which will highlight the importance of rare species. Another chapter that I'm working on is related to mortality and diversity. This is because there has been some research done in North American forests which found that more diverse forests tended to have higher levels of mortality. It will be interesting to see if this trend follows through to tropical rainforests, because tropical rainforests are very different, they are very differently managed, and they are much more diverse. And it is related to trying to understand the impact of of diversity on mortality, and trying to better understand what relationship these two factors have. And I will also be looking at diversity and resilience, specifically in regards to drought, in terms of looking at some forests which have been adapted to droughts because they've been undergoing long-term droughts, and seeing if there's essentially been any change in their species composition and diversity over time in order to do this. Thank you for listening to my talk.